we consider the micro or near environment. This complements the macro or far analysis. We will use Porter's 5 forces model to analyze the attractiveness of an industry. I'm Saideepa Kumar, Research Fellow at the Tasmanian Institute of Agriculture, here at the University of Tasmania. These lectures have been prepared with material supplied by Dr. Neil Ritson, who's Senior Lecturer at Lincoln University in New Zealand, and Dr. David Monkton, Lecturer Agribusiness here at University of Tasmania. Porter's analysis considers 5 forces: the threat of entry, the power of buyers, the power of suppliers, the threat of substitutes, and finally, competitive rivalry. We will look at each of these in turn. Barriers to entry. The major threat to an industry's existing firms is the ability of others to enter the market. They then compete for customers. This is especially important if the market is not growing. They will take market share and revenue from the existing organizations. There are a number of factors that discourage or prevent other organizations from entering your given market or markets. They are legislation or government action, including tariffs, quotas, taxes, and bureaucracy. Could be high capital requirements, for example, in terms of land or infrastructure requirements. There could be economies of scale and cost advantages within existing organizations. The availability of access to distribution channels may be constrained, thereby restricting entry for others. Existing organizations may retaliate in some way, through short-term price reductions, for example, to make your business unviable. The differentiation strategy of existing organizations also influences entry. So is there room for a similar commodity in the marketplace? Has product differentiation already been exhausted? If we take a look at supermarkets as an example, large retailers such as Walmart and others have such a strong presence that to enter the market and then compete, other firms must have significant capital to build new stores, agreements and access to cheap suppliers and then to distribution channels, a very strong balance sheet. It is almost impossible to create initial economies of scale. So there will be no cost advantages and cash flow will be negative. And finally, a plan to counter the retaliation by existing organizations. This could also be true for certain sectors of the horticultural industry in Australia. Next, we look at the power of buyers. Many people mistake end users or consumers for buyers. Buyers are those firms who buy your products. They are not necessarily the end users or consumers. Only if you have a retail organization which you own, only then are your direct consumers important. Mostly, there are only a few buyers in modern economies, supermarkets and agents. But there are often a large number of small operators in the industry, so buyers can easily switch, especially if the cost of switching to a competitor is low. So the threat of buyer power means that profits could be reduced because the buyers will negotiate price, delivery, quality, product design, packaging, and even the name of your product. There may even be backward integration. This could be a threat or benefit depending on whether the emphasis is more about supply chain logistics or a value chain relationship. 2 questions to ask yourself are, who are your buyers and what can they negotiate? An example of buyer power is that of Marks & Spencer, M&S, a UK retailer. This retailer opened food stores and negotiated with local farmers for a supply of fresh produce, but they insisted on a sole supply arrangement, tying in the farmers to M&S to avoid them switching to better deals with other supermarkets. M&S also negotiated with the food processors to supply chilled and frozen meals at a price. They built up the volume so that the suppliers and processors became dependent on M&S. Some processors had more than 70% of their output going to M&S. Next, M&S reduced the price they were willing to pay. And finally, they insisted on labeling the top-priced meals as M&S. This was more of a supply chain rather than value chain relationships. So how could this be changed? So we look at the power of suppliers. Supplier power is likely to be high when there are few suppliers. This is the main influencing factor the number of suppliers. The cost of you switching to another supplier is also a consideration. If the cost is high, it gives the supplier more power. The brand of the supplier is also important and can be powerful, particularly if your customers insist on certain production processes and inputs, thus restricting who and where you can source your supplies from. There is also a possibility of forward integration by the supplier. As with backward integration, this could be a threat or a benefit, depending on whether the emphasis is more about supply chain logistics or a value chain relationship. You could ask yourself the following questions. Who are your suppliers? Remember, banks also supply finance. Labor supply may be casual or seasonal. Where can you source this? What about finding skilled labor? Do you lease land? Buy greenhouses, equipment, chemicals, water, energy? Make a list. Next, we look at the threat of substitutes. Most products have a large number of substitutes. They can be in the same industry or often well outside the industry. Alcohol provides a useful illustration. Let's look at beer. Competitors would be other beer brands, but beer substitutes could include whiskey, gin, and wine. With alcohol more generally, it can be substituted by other drinks, Coke, tea, or coffee. Car tires are a good example of a non-substitutable product. Questions you need to ask yourself are, what are your products? If you run out of stock, what do buyers substitute them for? Do they go to another supplier or competitor for the same product? Or can you substitute another of your own products? Finally, we look at competitive rivalry. Competitive rivalry is between firms in the same industry and product market. Competition means driving up differentiation and innovations, which cost money, time, and effort, that is, higher costs. Often, it results in price competition or lower prices. High levels of competitive rivalry also create instability, uncertainty, thus making investment less attractive. A highly competitive industry is not one Porter favors investing in. Competitive rivalry is affected by a huge number of factors, some of which are the greater number of competitors, the more intense the competition. Fixed costs. High fixed costs means high exit barriers in an industry, so competitors stay in it for the long term. Low market growth rates will force price cuts, and in the long term, there could be issues of overcapacity in the industry. Are there options to differentiate your products? Questions you should ask yourself include, are your competitors' products similar to yours? Do you have the ability to make your product different, either the product itself or the way in which it is produced? In this clip, we have looked at the influence of industry on the business. Once again, consider what is most relevant to your situation: the threat of new entry, buyers, suppliers, substitutes, or competitive rivalry. And then think, what strategy can you develop to manage that?